Okay, but I want to thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. My name is Catherine Thompson. I'm the president of the Friends of Bushwick Inlet Park. And I'm here with other members of the Friends, Steve Chesler in particular, who has helped to put together this program tonight. And I want to make a call out to Emily Bauer, who's not here tonight, but she was really instrumental in helping to, gather panelists and think about ways to frame some of the questions and stuff. And we have Trina and Julie and lots of other volunteers that are very active. So welcome. And so tonight is very exciting. It's the second in our seminar series, and we're going to be talking about resilient park design, opportunities for Bushwick Inlet Park. And we've got three distinguished panelist guests, which I will get to soon. Stephen Whitehouse, Marcha Johnson, and Matthijs Bouw. And let's see. Okay, so who are the Friends of Bushwick Inlet Park? We do all kinds of stuff. We do programming, we do horticultural work and stewardship, we do tons of advocacy. And we have citizen science programs, and we do summer music series and other art and cultural programming. Oh, here's the agenda. So I'm going to do the welcome. I'm going to introduce everybody, and I think I'm going to introduce everybody after. Well, I'll introduce everybody, and then I'm going to do a quick history of the park to give people context of what we're talking about and what the conversation is going to be about tonight. Okay. So our guest tonight, we have Matthijs Bouw, is a Dutch architect and urbanist and founder of One Architecture, award-winning Amsterdam and New York-based design and planning firm. Bouw's practice is known for its unique approach in which programmatic, financial, technical, and organizational issues are studied, communicated, and resolved through design. In recent years, this approach has found an important application through a body of climate adaptation and resilience projects across the U.S. Bouw also directs the Urban Resilience Certificate Program for the University of Pennsylvania Stuart Weitzman School of Design, where he is a professor of practice and Rockefeller Urban Resilience Fellow. Tonight, Matthijs will share lessons from leading large-scale resilience projects in New York City, Boston, and beyond. Drawing from his work on the Financial District and Seaport Climate Resilience Master Plan, Eastside Coastal Resiliency Project, and Climate Ready Boston, he will explore how comprehensive climate adaptation strategies can be applied at the scale of Bushwick Inlet Park. His insights will focus on integrating flood protection, ecological restoration, and public space design, offering a vision for how the park can serve as a model for urban resilience in North Brooklyn. Thank you for coming. And we also have Marcha Johnson here. Marcha is PhD ASLA and a New York City landscape architect and ecological restorationist with about 40 years of specializing in shoreline designs with high habitat value in all 5 boroughs. Marcha work highlights ways to better understand and respect coastal landscapes, design spaces affected by sea level rise and storms, and live more wisely along the water. She serves on the advisory board for Riverkeeper and on the technical advisory board, Hudson River Park. An adjunct professor at City College of New York School of Architecture since 1990, she teaches graduate courses in landscape architecture and sustainability. She co-led New York State-supported cooperative effort in 2010 called Designing the Edge. Her projects include marsh restorations, porous gabion walls containing shells to attract living crust of shellfish, green walls, a precast system of open stackable shells that provides the stability of riprap with spaces for plants and a variety of other ecologically supportive features. Marcha's philosophy about urban shoreline design is based on returning some of the value of floodplains to the shore, making room for the inward expansion of beaches and water edges. and recognizing that waterfront disasters are mostly related to building rigid structures in places that are subject to natural floods, sea level rise, and storms. So for this presentation, she will discuss shoreline ecology in general and some considerations for Bushwick Inlet, but not her New York City Parks designs, as she is speaking as an individual, not representing the city or any of the other institutions which she's involved with. So thank you, Marcha. And finally, we have Stephen Whitehouse, and Stephen Whitehouse is kind of coming back home here at Bushwick Inlet Park. He actually designed this first section of Bushwick Inlet Park and Marcha Johnson. So Stephen Whitehouse is a landscape architect and urban planner whose diverse pursuits share a concern for the environment, quality, and social vitality of places. He formerly served as Chief of Planning for New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, where he managed the expansion of the USTA National Tennis Center in Flushing Meadows and launched the city's greenway system. Since founding Starr Whitehouse with Laura Starr, he has worked with public and private clients to create a dynamic urban districts and engaging landscapes that connect people to nature. Rather than focusing on a single aspect of the work, he's always been most fascinated by the juncture points, natural systems, patterns of settlement, infrastructure. Seeing all these come together to make places interesting to me, not as just abstract concepts, he says, but in terms of seeing good results at the end. He describes his role in terms of junctures as well. I'm the translator, he says. I serve as a mediator between the specialists and the public. I like communicating with people and seeing things shaped by the creative interactions of people and institutions. So, thank you for coming. Now, I thought it would be important for us to just have a little recap of what exactly we're talking about when we are referring to Bushwick Inlet Park. So this is a map of the historic creeks along the this floodplain, which is the Bushwick, where the Bushwick Creek empties out into the river, into the East River. And you can see that originally there was marshes, and we were in a floodplain that went all the way up into McCarran Park and beyond. This is a recent depiction of from NYC Flood Hazard Mapper. Anybody can go on this. You can do that QR code and put your zip code in and find out, where the water is. So this is the floodplain that they say is 2020, which is a few years ago. And Bushwick Inlet Park, I don't know, it's there where that dot is, inside that sort of inlet coming in from the East River. And that's what we're talking about. And here we have our, the park, and it's divided up into 5 different portions parcels, because over the course of, since like 2005, when they decided to make this park, and 2007, the city has acquired each parcel of land independently and over, the course of many years. And the last parcel was purchased in 2016 when Mayor de Blasio purchased the city storage building. And so why are we getting this park? Well, back in the day, in 2005, the city of New York decided to rezone the Greenpoint Williamsburg waterfront. And with this, they changed the industrial waterfront into residential, and mostly high-rise residential. And part of the plan was they discovered that had very little open space, so they decided to map a park, Bushwick Inlet Park. And through this process, the community got together and they came up with this design, and they worked with Donawakovich and landscape designers, and had a lot of community meetings. And this is the original master plan of the park. from 2007. And so this is what we're going to be talking about today. A little more about the history. Bushwick Inlet Park is incredibly polluted. It's where the birthplace of the fossil fuel industry was. Sometimes people in the Newtown Creek like to claim that, but actually it started here. That's my joke. So we're cleaning it up, parcel by parcel. It's very expensive. It has to be paid for by the responsible parties. Of course, responsible parties aren't usually interested in doing that, and there's very complicated legal negotiations between DEC, the Parks Department, the city. Just a little recap, 86 Kent, where we are right now, was the Brooklyn Eastern Terminal Market until the 1980s. This is where people used to come in the 1980s after it was kind of abandoned. It was kind of an accidental playground, an accidental park for skaters and punks and, people just like hanging out in urban infrastructure. 50 Kent is where the most recent portion of the park is opened. This is a very polluted area that has been remediated completely, but this was the first gaslight company where they manufactured gas plant, and the byproduct of that is very toxic, and it costs millions of dollars to remediate. And then next to that, going up north towards Bushwick Inlet, we have the Astral Oil Works, where the kerosene production began with Charles Pratt. And then J.D. Rockefeller came in with Standard Oil and acquired many companies and solidified his power. And so after it's just been used, it was used to store petroleum gas for years.
So we should be okay before we record. So thanks for having me here. I'm sort of announced as someone who can talk about global experiences in waterfront planning. We do a lot of work in New York. I brought a little bit of that to give you some context of what we're
Can
doing
you use
here.
the mic, please?
I am using the mic, but
Closer?
be closer, yeah?
That's it. You would like this.
And I'll just hold it in my hand. Okay, that's better. That also allows me to move a bit. So I've been announced as, thank you for having me here, I've been announced as someone who can talk about global experiences in waterfront planning and resilience. I won't take you on a tour around the world. I'll talk a little bit about the work we do in New York as a context setter, but also maybe to talk about how this is very different from what I think is happening here at Bushwick Inlet. And then I took one project from our portfolio that I really love and that I really want to show you, because I think it might have some clues or prompt a conversation that might be interesting for this room. Okay. Got it. So I came to New York in 2014 in the aftermath of a design that I've been working on with a Danish architect called Bjarke Engels, with Steve and his colleagues, and also others in the Ripple by Design competition. And the design was called the Big U. And the idea of the Big U was, hey, if you want to build climate infrastructure, you shouldn't think of it as infrastructure, but you should think of it as social infrastructure as much as possible, to make sure that whatever you build in terms of coastal protection is not only an infrastructure that performs during big storm surges, but that also has value for the community and is developed with the community on all those other days that no storm is threatening. That Big U is slowly finding its space in New York. East Side Coastal Resiliency is under construction. The Brooklyn Bridge Montgomery Coastal Resilience Project is under construction. The Financial District Master Plan is in planning, and there are some other projects that are pretty far ahead as well. And slowly, the city or Manhattan is being sort of surrounded by this system of elevated parks, flood walls, and other flood infrastructure. That's work, partly because it has to follow congressional deadlines and had to be built to a large extent within the 10 years that was given, is happening mostly on land. And so it's also pretty much what I would call very much a constructed infrastructure with a sort of green layer on top of it. I think within the density, within the complexity of Manhattan, there's a sort of logic to that, but it's also to a certain extent a sort of missed opportunity. At the same time, these type of projects do need to get built because we also understand that we are in a climate crisis where climate change is accelerating and where like a Sandy type flood will be a sort of 10-year flood within a lifetime, and that sea level rise will continue. And that's just scary to see. The recent election and the current action by the president are not helping. This graph by now might be much worse, but we need to, as a society, build projects, practice, and start to build the adaptation capacity, because otherwise much of the city will start flooding even on a daily basis towards the end of the century. And so this is partly the tidal flood map of Lower Manhattan as part of the FBIP coastal master plan, which is a project that we're now bringing into 30% design, which is like I think the most ambitious project, where we are trying to build a sort of two-level promenade with, let's say, a park on top and the connections to the water at the lower level that will help protect the financial district against sea level rise. This for context. Much of these projects I feel are pretty good, but they also do not really help us conceive this long-term future that we're all dealing with and that we all have to navigate. They are important projects that will help the city make its transition to higher sea levels. They will help us for the next century or so, maybe the next 2 centuries, but in some way we need to start thinking over the long term in a very different way. And that's what we explored in this project in the city of Vancouver, Canada, where we worked with a firm called Methuen and a group of First Nation representatives, artists, designers, on a vision for this area in Vancouver, which is called Falls Creek. And for us it was really interesting to start that work and in that process learn a lot from the First Nation people, from Indigenous people about the sort of history of that place. And to understand that in pre-colonial times the relationship to the water was very different. They took us to other places in the region where that relationship was still very much there, but they helped us understand how maybe through the way we build our cities, our landscapes have been formed over time, and also the ecosystems that have been lost in this process. What they've learned us, and taught us very much, is what they express as sort of two-way, two-eyed seeing, where we needed to sort of learn how to approach these type of questions, maybe on the one hand with the sort of technical know-how and expertise and knowledges and ways of knowing from the Western world, but also understanding indigenous ways of knowing. And that brought to us an understanding that was of this place that was really, for me, eye-opening. The client, the city, asked us to look at, protect, as a scenario, adapt as a scenario, and retreat as a scenario. The sort of militarized terms that we use in coastal defense. And when we started talking about these things with the local communities, we started to understand that maybe other words could help us understand this place in a different way. Maybe in terms of protect, we could start use the word acknowledge. Maybe in terms of adapt, we could start to use the word reciprocate. Maybe if rather than retreat, we should start to think about repair. And that, to us, brought us to a sort of vision of the park, or a vision of the creek that really started to sort of undo much of the constructed systems that were there. And of course, one of the reasons that we know is that those constructed systems have destroyed a lot of ecological diversity, right? We have bulkheads and walls, and that is just, and Marcha knows everything about that, and her work is all about that. That is not beneficial for ecological diversity. And so if the creek used to look like this, it now looks like this, and with this very different gradient, it just offers very few possibilities for bringing the original ecosystems back. So our idea in this project was to say, well, maybe now this waterfront has been overbuilt over time. The Olympic Village is here. There's some other developments here on what is essentially public land. Maybe we should start to think directly about this sort of long-term vision of bringing the creek back as much as possible in its original state, and essentially relocate some of those buildings that were at a certain point at the end of their lease, at the end of the economic use, and use it as an opportunity for land use changes. And so our project was really about starting to think, can we move things out of this floodplain where they shouldn't belong? Can we do that step by step, because these are processes for over 50 or 100 years, where step by step we start to bring nature back into the creek. This is an example of what that could look like at the area of Stamps Landing, where you could start to see how these ecosystems could be used for connectivity, how your ecological systems could nest in there, and how the Squamish and so could, let's say, heritage could find its place there. Similarly for Olympic Village, I won't go too much into that because I have very little time, but really the idea was to say we need to think big, we need to think long term, and we need to find ways to acknowledge, reciprocate, but in the end, repair these damages that have been done to these ecosystems. And while you create such a vision, we realized at the same time that it's very important to get started. So we are now working with the city of Vancouver on a sort of number of smaller pilot projects that help us understand how this change could happen, how this change could happen in an equitable way that acknowledges and that works together with the service nations, and that allows us to step by step understand this process of adaptation, adapt the process of adaptation, for instance through a habitat bench where we use the original sort of inspired by the logs that have these beautiful ecosystems sort of nested into them, inspired also by the local art, to sort of see how we can start nurturing and creating places for ecosystems to settle themselves, how we can from there on learn and connect to the local culture, and through that process also create the knowledge and the capacity to start doing this at scale. This is the second pilot that we're working on. It's the forest berm. It is one particular place where we are elevating the lands to test all the different gradients that will then settle themselves along this waterfront, different ecosystems, and with that organize a research program that tries to bring in Squamish and Salvatier's knowledge to help us understand climate adaptation and to really start bringing this to IT, these type of collaborations into practice, while over time growing the seeders that this culture still wants to be there at those locations 100 or 200 years from now. I think I'll leave it there. I hope this is a project that can inspire you to do all kinds of great things as you're mapping out the future of Bushwick Inlet. Thank you.
The homeland of the Lenape people who are still here after tens of thousands of years, and with great gratefulness and respect for all the stewardship that they've provided. So I'm, as Catherine mentioned, I'm not going to be talking on behalf of the New York City Parks Department, but for full transparency, I do work for parks, proudly work for parks, but I am here as an independent voice of somebody who's been studying the shoreline and the ecology of it. I may not agree with some of the city's policies, so I just want to be upfront about that. And also the other, I don't represent Riverkeeper or Hudson River Park or any of the other organizations in City College that I work for. So just so long as wanted to make that clear. So my interest here, why am I here? I'm not going to talk about design. I'm not going to criticize the designs that have been done. I'm not going to provide ideas to plug into a future design. What I'd like to talk about is the shoreline ecology in its context for the whole of the East River, and some of the observations that I've made over about 40 years of working on shoreline projects. And some of the lessons that we could learn, that we all here could learn from some of the things that have happened. They're not necessarily mistakes, but there's a lot of things that one designs for the waterfront that the water changes. Even a minute after the construction is done, the water is moving and acting. The wind is acting on it. You have people coming, looking at stuff and trampling things that you thought were going to be there forever, and they're gone in a week. So it's a very active and dynamic area, and I'll just talk a little bit about some of those things. So my interest is in discussing the conditions of the East River. There we go. So what I'm going to, just in general, give a little outline. Physical conditions, the shoreline, the upland, the bottom, the types of sediment, the edges, what was there before, what's there now, the ecological and biological, the organisms that live here or could live here, including the plants and the shellfish and the fish and the various other plankton, all other things that are in the water, and the cultural context of very complicated legal, community, changes of administration, contamination, trying to rebuild on top or instead of contaminated areas with lots of impacts of all different sorts, and the development that's coming as well. So physical context, and I'm sure that some of you know more about some of these topics than I do. So please allow me to I don't want to talk down to you or anything like that, but I just would like to share my observations, and as I said, I'm sure some of you know more about it, and maybe we can talk about that as we go on. So the physical context is you have this little inlet that has been planned for generations now. And I was involved in some of the early planning when, before any of this was public land, there was community groups that asked, and I live in Brooklyn, so I came up and participated in some workshops. There's this little inlet that has caught people's imaginations for a long time. And there's a lot of love for that little spot. Maybe outside of, or out of proportion with how big it really is. And then there's also the rest of the waterfront, which is partly naturalizing on its own, volunteer plants coming in and just setting up business, and birds coming in and finding those, and also designers coming and cleaning it up and doing urbanizing the waterfront for the people that want to use it in different ways. And then most recently, as you probably know, there have been dolphins in the East River. And there are a lot of sort of surprising things about the ecology that because they're underwater, we don't always see. But it's full of life, even though it's has been impacted tremendously by human activities here. So I'm going to just walk over here because it's a little easier. So in the overall context of what's happening with the water in the inlet, which is over here, here's Newtown Creek. I'll start with the beaches out here on Coney Island and Fire Island and Jones Beach and so on. These beaches are nourished, as they say, by taking sand from offshore and widening the natural beach two or three or four times the natural width. And that happens repeatedly. So the Army Corps of Engineers grabs sand off of here, places it on the beaches. This is Coney Island. And within a decade or so, that sand returns to the ocean and to the active water. Some of that sand moves around. I had a project right here, and people were disturbed by the sand moving around, coming into their front yards, their backyards, into their through the windows into their houses. But there is this trend of water moving, little drift, it's sometimes called, moving inward like this. And some of that sand makes its way into the East River, and the East River has a net flow, although it goes back and forth and back and forth. The net flow is believed to be, and is somewhat debatable, believed to be towards Long Island Sound. So we end up having this flushing of sediment and sand from this area into that part of the river. And as you can see, as you move up through here, you have a big wide area. This is slower. When it starts to go through these narrow areas, the water speeds up. And when it gets into where there are rocky islands and turbulence on irregularities on the ground, underwater on the bottom part, it becomes very turbulent. So you have this combination of a lot of sand and sediment moving through the East River, making it turbid, and getting all turned up and stirred up. And as it makes its way through the area around the inlet, some of that probably comes into the inlet. I don't know that anyone has actually studied the sedimentation of Bushwick Inlet, but that would be a very interesting thing to know as the planning proceeds. What's happening? Is it accumulating material? Is it eroding? Is it losing material? What are the sedimentation patterns there? And then we go zoom in a little bit more. We have right near the inlet, we have the shipping channel. And I'll show you another illustration in just a minute. But you have shallow water here. Catherine showed floodplain areas. Shallow water here, and then right next to it, it drops from like 8 feet to about 40 feet, 35 or 40 feet. So there's this big drop off. That indicates a very interesting thing. If you're a fish, there's a lot of diversity a lot of difference between deep water and shallow water, and that interface is quite interesting. I'll also just mention that we're at a moment right now where, aside from aside from the inlet per se, we're also at a moment where we're recognizing that ocean conservation is very important. Our oceans really need our assistance, and everything that we do on the shoreline ultimately affects what's going on in the ocean. So what's happening here is we have this shipping channel with this alternating deep water and shallow water areas, and then we get freshwater pulses. Every time we get a big storm of rain, fresh water flows rapidly through that area in the channel, but it also flows off of the city streets, and some of it makes its way directly into the water. So there's another source of the turbidity and sediment in the East River, and that's from upland runoff, washing, silt and sand and grit and all the other stuff that's attached to the grit into those waterways and ultimately through CSOs as well into the creek, into the inlet. So here's the nautical chart. Nautical charts are for people in boats looking to find markers that they can see from the water to navigate where they are. So here's the inlet, but it's useful to look at from a planning perspective because the colors tell you something about the topography. The upland, higher uplands are this darker tan. The lighter tan are the low-lying areas. So you can just see at a glance where it's pretty close to the water's edge. And here's our East River resiliency area, pretty close to the water level. The blue is between like 4 and 8 feet depth. And then we have this channel that I know you probably can't see the numbers because it's a little fuzzy, but it drops quickly right there from 8 feet down to 30 feet, 34 or 35 feet. So this diversity of and power that's in the East River. A few years ago, people tried to do a tidal, to capture the tidal power with an underwater machine, and it was torn to pieces by the turbulence in the East River. It's not to, you can see it sometimes on the surface, but if it's, when you're underwater, it's a very powerful force. So that's what the water context is like. Then there's also this cultural context of the industrial and especially the manufactured gas kind of industries, which are among the worst possible urban pollutants. They're dangerous for humans, they're dangerous for the shellfish, they're dangerous for fish and birds. And so cleaning up these kinds of brownfield sites is unquestionably a good thing. However, those cleanups also have a lot of environmental impacts. They typically involve dredging vast amounts of gunk, really toxic gunk, and taking it somewhere else. I think currently we're shipping it to Virginia, maybe Pennsylvania. It doesn't just disappear. It has impacts wherever it ends up, even though it's going to landfills that are paying to have it. It's not a benign kind of thing when we talk about cleaning up, it's just done and gone. It has a long-lasting heritage in other places as well. Okay, so this is probably familiar to you. This is the original stream channels for the inlet and overlaid with the industrial edge of it. And, kind of overlaid again. And when you look at the floodplains, and I'm sure since you all live nearby here, and I've seen it a little bit myself, but just as bicycling through, along Kent is pretty close to the water level. And I'm sure that over time, as sea level rises, 6 or 7 more feet, Kent Avenue will be potentially underwater more frequently. And so it may be that some of the urban infrastructure might need to go around the floodplain instead of forcing the floods to stay on outside of the city, acknowledging that flooding is a part of the shore and has very important ecological functions. And it's also just interesting, it may be a valuable thing to start thinking long-term about how to live with the floodplain instead of just building walls to keep it out. So what would be useful to know? If you were putting together a program to try to ask the best minds of the time, best scientists and the most knowledgeable people, what could you ask that would be useful in planning the long term of this area? Well, if for the inlet particularly, for the first thing you would want to know what is the water depth. So I don't know that I have seen some maps that show generally I think it's probably rather imprecise and it's changeable. But it would be very useful to know the water depth, the historic vegetation. We know that the inlet right now is just a little tiny bit of what was there before. But what was the vegetation? Is it the same vegetation that's growing wild now, the sumac and other spontaneous volunteers, or was it something else? If you were going to try to restore the original or something similar to a functioning ecosystem, it would be very useful to know what the system supported in the past. And I won't read through all of this, but it would be very useful to know if the sediment is gravelly, sandy, or silty. Why? Because you have different organisms that occur when you have sand versus gravel versus silt. And if you were planning to do oysters, make oyster reefs, or do something that was going to support, say, eels, which are a species of concern, you would need to know if they prefer one kind of substrate over another. So it would be useful to know what the substrates are. Along the shoreline, Marcha Johnson Park, for example, it looks like it's a gravelly shore. At Grand Ferry Park, we would get sediment coming right down the street that was fine sediment, but the edge was riprap rock. We don't know what the original edge was like because it was filled up, but it'd be useful to know what the original conditions were if you were going to try to approximate that with a restoration. And it would be useful to know where the sediment and the inlet originates, and if there are some target species, if there are plants or animals or shellfish or birds that you particularly would like to help support, it's useful to know what they are and what they need in order to have this be part of their life cycle. It's very rare for birds in a shoreline to stay put, to park themselves and just stay there and stay there and stay there. Most birds fly to feed, and they come back to somewhere else to nest, and somewhere else to roost, and somewhere else to maybe do other activities. So most of the organisms that you would think about in the context of the shoreline are making use of different kinds of habitats that are connected. If they're disconnected too much, birds can fly, so they can hop over some kinds of obstacles. But if there's too much disconnect, then they just won't be there. They won't find what it takes to help them reproduce. So inland migration of beaches and shorelines. There is a lot of misunderstanding about this term erosion of beaches. As I mentioned, when we're expanding the beaches in Coney Island, they always talk about, we lost 200 feet of beach in this big storm. Well, it didn't really get lost, it just moved. And so that's a very kind of a critical thing, because it's publicized in the papers and it's talked about in planning as though you have to stop erosion. And all this riprap and walls is about stopping erosion. But erosion is only half of the story. Accretion and deposition of that material that moved is the other part. So one of the things that kind of take-home message is the shorelines, to be as natural as possible and to function, need to have a little bit of flex, at least a little bit of flex. And in some places, to be quite flexible. Our typical urban shorelines, we've very, very seriously tried to stop them moving, and that's, we're fighting the natural systems. So sand is constantly building up on these places where we think it's going to just stay where it's supposed to stay. And for example, in Far Rockaways after Sandy, they build these nice boardwalks which just get covered with sand and then become slippery and difficult to navigate, and they're constantly brewing them off. So if you put beaches in a place and expect them to stay put, you will be fighting it forever. If you put a beach in a place, or you support a beach in a place where it's naturally occurring and it's in approximately the right width of what the system can support, it will stay there. The sand will move, but the beach will stay, if that makes sense. Sand is constantly moving, but you'll still have a beach. So this is an example of what happened after Sandy with the planning in the city. The mayor's office took a lot of very good, took time and took very knowledgeable people and some great photographs to analyze what happened. So here's before Sandy with a big wide beach, and here's after Sandy. And the way this was presented was, look how much we've lost. We've lost all of this width. But if you look at it from another perspective, you can see that this beach just moved up. And people were complaining about the sand in the street and the sand on the grass and all of this, and they didn't recognize that it was just the beach that was trying to become the beach where they had displaced it before. Okay, I'm going to go on here. So that's inland migration. It's happening all over the world. As sea level rises, the shores are moving inland. The water line is moving inland. That's just in case we need to talk about it. In general, it's useful to, I pointed this out because I saw in the master plans that there is a beach plan, and I see that there's a little beach already constructed. In general, beaches are supported where there was a beach before, where the conditions, the sand and the waves and the wind and so on, support a beach. This is one that's, nobody planned it, nobody designed it. It's just accumulating on the edge of Governor's Island. There's no reason to have a hard seawall there because it's not eroding. It's building up. So just to point out that by observation and a little analysis, you can avoid making some mistakes. So some of the ecological contexts include the upland vegetation, the shoreline vegetation and birds and animals that live in the shoreline, and what's in open water. And there are different species that occupy these different, or use these different areas at different times. These are some of the species, just a little sample there. You could go on for a long time. And if you're wondering what those killdeer are doing, they're having sex. On the bottom, the very bottom substrates, in a nutshell, it's gravel and rock, sandy bottom and mud bottom. But we also have concrete, which is kind of like rock. So a lot of the organisms that would be on rocks, you see them growing on the concrete, you see them attaching to concrete. And sometimes stone, man-made seawalls that are made of roughened stone. So these are some of the species that are probably possible in the inlet. I'd like to just say for a moment, mention the horseshoe crab, which needs to come out onto a little sandy spit. And the little sandy beach that I saw, I thought, well, that might be a place where you could see horseshoe crabs. We know they're in the system, and I've seen them come swimming up and bumping up into the seawalls. There's no place for them to get out into sand, but they're bumping along, trying to find a place where it's a little shallow. So that might be a thing that could be, that you might see as time goes by here. Some of the species of concern, the endangered, the rare, the ones that are threatened, the ones that are charismatic megafauna, like the dolphins, are some of these are some of them. And there's a long list. This is a little sample. American eels, especially the very young eels, which are called glass eels, are species that people have been trying to support because their populations crashed, and that's something that, along with oyster reef building, people in the area are attempting to do. There's also an exotic green crab, which is present in Newtown Creek and probably around here, and is something to also to be concerned about. And they eat some of the other things that you might want to have here. If there's if there's a desire to build marsh, it takes a little bit of flat space in front on the seaward side of the marsh, as well as behind, where it is really knit and thrive. Otherwise, these thin strips of marsh are very vulnerable to being torn apart. So, wrapping up the cultural context, we have this heritage of pollution, and there's also emerging contaminants, which include microplastics, and we now know that field turf, the plastic field grass, is a source of microplastics that washes directly into rivers and so on. It has many benefits, but that is a concern as we go forward and we learn more about it. Pharmaceuticals, which are basically when people flush their medicines down the toilet, it goes into the system and is not filtered out by our water treatment. PFAS, which are, we call them forever chemicals because they're very hard to break down. We're learning that they come from washing our clothes, our artificial and man-made clothes. So some of the observations from other East River areas which I've worked on, this short story is the beaches move around. This was Brooklyn Bridge Park. We put shells and created an opportunity for there to be a beach, and there's still a beach, but it's moved. There are places where you can create a little something like a marsh right in the infrastructure. This is Little Hellgate on the Randall's Island side, where they're finding that they planted a marsh and it's accumulating sand and building up. So the low marsh is becoming high marsh, the high marsh is becoming marsh edge, and the edge is becoming upland. How is that possible? Sea level is rising and most marshes are being flooded. This one is building itself up. Grand Ferry Park, where the original idea was to create kind of a dune, it blew away. It was very, very windy. So the wind is something to be concerned about. Rigid things in the shoreline don't last that long. Fragmented habitats are common across the whole city. When we have an opportunity to make a connection between the water and the adjacent marsh, it's much healthier than if we have a divide like that. And considering trash. So a little thing like the inlet is probably collecting a certain amount of floatable material, both from just washing in on the tide and washing out from the CSOs and the streams. So it's something to consider how to get rid of the trash. It's hard to pick it up if it's too difficult to get to. And a very wise ocean coastal geologist, Orrin Pilkey, who recently died at the end of last year, wrote a great book called Living by the Rules of the Sea. I won't read these for you, but there are some predictable things that you can learn about how the sea behaves and avoid making some constantly fighting it. So some implications for next steps. We have doing basically some studies and recognizing that locations with vulnerability to coastal storms, it's not necessarily a threat unless you place yourself in the storm path. So moving out the hard structures would be a wise thing at these floodable areas. And I'll just leave it at that. This is a black-crowned night heron right in the urbanized edge of Newtown Creek. And as you know, I'm sure you've seen these kinds of birds and critters living remarkably right in the urban environment. So, thank you.
This is the live one. Okay. I have 41 slides. I told Steve Chester I could do this in 15 minutes, which was my allotted time, and I'll see if I can do it. Sort of a slideshow. I'm going to just talk about two parks. I'm going to talk about the parks right here. I'm going to talk about a park in Hoboken, and I hope there's some themes that resonate. But it was one of the lucky things that fell into my lap, if you will, that I was able to design the 86 Kent site. I return to this. The red line there is the site that was given there, and there were some interesting things about it. The program was set by the master plan that was done before me. Oh, that's fine. That's fine. The program was set by the master plan that was done before. There was community building, youth athletic field, and the notion that there was a restaurant at the waterfront. But there was something there. And the Parks Department put it out to a designer, a mini RFP to designers and asked us to do designs. And this is a sketch by people at Kish Cathcart, by I think actually Greg Miles did this. This was the sketch we had at the competition. And it's the sort of the party that you have there right now with the building on the slope, the field, and then a zone next to the waterfront. And something that's more like a terrace at the shoreline, but notice that there are also some paths that suggest there's continuity northward to the future phases of Bushwick Inlet Park. And this turned into the same sort of three-part party along the central spine of North 9th Street, again with the building to slow through, the artificial turf field, and then this waterfront acre that was separate for it. And it was important. One of the things we tried to do here, I love New York City, I love New York City parks, I hate New York City parks filled with fences that feel like cages for kids. And the idea here is, could we do a soccer field and we do all these things without a lot of boundaries and fences? And it does mean the balls fly around a bit, but by using things like some hills, some elevation change, some low walls, some lines of trees, can we create a set of sequence environments that feels more natural and open? At the waterfront, this was from Bing. This is from about 2004 or something like this. This was Enterprise Rent-A-Car, was the use that was in there at the time. The old abandoned pier from the railroad operations. The red structure is a Coast Guard structure that aligns with another out in the water that's actually on the navigation charts, and it had to stay. But you'll notice there's also a sort of hard, not very good condition, but a hard seawall going north from the Coast Guard structure. That became, this is an early sketch, this is a clay model superimposed over that. The restaurant becomes the waterfront terrace. There's a notion I'll describe later about the water. And then it is an engineered shoreline, but how can we make an engineered shoreline to mimic some of the features and gradients of more natural shorelines like a rocky coast, and to keep just enough of do just as little work as possible with that old pier to make it not a hazard, and it actually creates a sort of tombolo island off of there, which is actually accreted sand and material from the river as it was done. And that was the basic. It was also done very much, let me just say, we had a couple charges. We had charged to do this very fast. And to make this permitting process as quick as possible. The pier at Transmitter Park, as lovely as it is, took 4 years to get through the Army Corps of Engineers and the Public Design Commission to make, in terms of the approval process. This got approved in 3 months by the Army Corps of Engineers and the state DEC. We pulled back from the shoreline, we did no fill, we worked within knowing the trigger points of the regulations and how to do something in line with what the regulations wanted from an environmental point of view. We didn't have to push to the edge to maximize development. We could pull back, we could make it happen quickly. And we kept the seawall there at the north end where not messing with that structure which extended all the way up into property that wasn't ours at that time, where the Coast Guard structure. So, and this also had a notion, we also had a charge to make this an environmental demonstration project. This is a LEED Platinum project from start to finish. This building, I won't go into all the systems that are here. It is thermally heated and cooled, ground source thermal heated and cooled. It doesn't burn fossil fuel. And the site doesn't contribute any water to the city's combined sewer system. It's not working now, I'm sorry to say, but the whole system of water was collected off the roof and from the spray shower, and it's actually treated here to irrigate the green roof here with locally captured water. The crushed stone base of the field is the stormwater reservoir for the site. There was an early, the planting is long since gone, a bioswale along the main path between the field there, which is a wonderful horticultural path to think about. And then in the event of a very large storm, that there would be a discharge of site stormwater only through a system to the East River. It would be, yes, it's still urban runoff, it's polished urban runoff, and much more the characteristic of a natural flow of stormwater out to the rivers. And you talk about oysters. Oysters actually like to be where there's a flow of fresh water to salt water and lower salt content water than the open ocean. And these are the systems that are largely recharged in New York City now by combined sewage overflows. This was to take this out of that combined sewage overflow and to make it a natural flow. So, and that system works. This is part of the construction of the riverfront terrace. And all those rocks you see out there were brought in. There weren't rocks here. The underlying material here was granite cobbles and coal furnace clinker. And it's not really gravel, it's coal furnace clinker under these sites as the sort of grayish material that was there. The green roof in its early construction. The view out in the field, this is like year 2 after the project is built, I think. The trees are now quite a bit bigger. The artificial turf is replaced because the first one got pulverized. After about 10 years of use, it's like a carpet. And that is one of the challenges about the artificial turf, for sure. And it probably about 2,000 people a week using this field through the summertime. And the feature of the waterfront always was intended to be a respite from that activity of the waterfront idle, if you will. Here at the waterfront terrace, people see the edge. And this, you may recognize yourself from this crowd here, how much I love to see this last summer. And groups like the Friends and other, that these places are active, that they are used, that they are supporting social life. Also interesting to note, Hurricane Sandy came up about 4 inches above the level of that terrace. It came onto the site, it came off of this site. Might have lost a cubic yard of soil through Hurricane Sandy. If anything, the shoreline accreted, lots of nice sand came up from Marcha Johnson Park and landed on the beaches here and made a sandier beach here. And those honey locust trees bounced back without any damage from the full saltwater bath. And a view just from the boat a few years ago, before there are more buildings in the background now, as you know. But just to see the array of people on the hill, on the shore, beachcombing, exploring it, it's one of the things I love to see. Several years later, we were brought in to also assist in Marcha Johnson Park after an impasse. I'll use the term here of the plastic park. We were brought in to do something that we didn't do at Bushwick Inlet Park at all, and my partner, Starr, really led this effort. We were brought in to conduct a public process to try to find a way forward. And we did lots of intensive outreach over 6-week periods. We were out here in the park in the height of COVID. We did a whole series of Zoom things, and maybe many of you participated in it, I don't know. And to try to find a way forward that would satisfy the various constituencies. And really the sort of, if there was a thematic central point, came around horticulture as something not necessarily in state parks' wheelhouse, but as something that was both acceptable and expressive of Marcha P. Johnson, and something that was seen as beneficial from the community, and that became really the unifier here for moving forward with this plan. So we worked with, helped develop this plan, executed along with NV5, and the horticulture is there. It's looking pretty good through the winter. Can't wait to see it come out again this spring. And a little overview of this park here. We never knew, of course, when we worked on Bushwick Inlet Park that we'd ever have anything to do with next door, and of course, hopefully it has something to do with the future of Bushwick Inlet Park going forward. And whoever does it, I hope it's great. I will say one thing. I'm sorry, I'm going to tell a terrible joke that I tell. It's sort of a joke. It's one of the ironies of history. As challenging as the Astral Oil Works were, and the sort of environmental degradation and legacy that they and their successors left here, they saved the whale. Kerosene destroyed the whale oil industry. Killed it. Because it was cheaper, easier, and more available and less hazardous to get. A strange irony of history, but we're going to clean up here. Hoboken. This is Southwest Park at Hoboken, or Southwest Resiliency Park at Hoboken, a project I started about 10 years ago, and I'm still working on various phases of it now. It is in the southwestern corner of Hoboken. You can see that little red dot over there on the left, and here it is here. And it is in an area that was all industrial and is now rapidly being redeveloped into a residential district. Sound familiar? So there are parallels here. It's also a very dense community. There are 50,000 plus people living in 1 square mile. It's as dense as any neighborhood in New York. It is, however, and this is what that area looked like. That is actually the hill of Hoboken next to the Hudson River. On the distance there, so this picture on the right is taken from the Palisades looking down, and this picture on the left is taken from somewhere down on Patterson Plank Road, which is still Patterson Road there now, looking back up towards the Palisades. That is what the neighborhood looks like now. That is not Hurricane Sandy, that is a summer thunderstorm. That is chronic flooding. Hoboken is much like New Orleans as any city in the Northeast, and a sort of harbinger of the future of what can happen to a whole lot of places with sea level rise. So our site there is in the yellow, which is the flood zone, and it's actually the high ground that you see across the river in the white there. That's the sort of historic hill of Hoboken where Stevens Tech is. This is done by OMA. This is their rebuild by design competition graphic. While I was working with Matthijs on the Big U, they were doing this, and they came up, and our site is back in this corner down here, where it's flash floodland, and the surge points there. So they had a 4-point, this was their strategy, their mantra there, resist, which had to do with barriers at the points of vulnerability, delay, which had to do with slowing flow of water, store, and then discharge at control points. And so our project in our area had nothing to do with resist, but it's really about delay, store, and discharge. And that was the site, that parking lot of the first phase. And this park was identified through a community planning effort long before Sandy, as part of the residential resettlement of this corner of Hoboken. And then Sandy happened before our design process. What was interesting is Hoboken has rough and tumble politics, but very representative politics. City councilman in New York City represents about 180,000 people. The mayor represents 50,000 here, and there are 9 councilmen. So a council person represents 6,000 people. Everybody knows everybody. And we were told that to develop this whole program of the park interactively with the public. Every element of the program there came out through a public session. We developed all these different design alternatives, taking their ideas of program, redistributing them in different combinations that fit. This got voted on in public meetings, got voted on in internet backup as well. What came through is sort of some of the evidence from the charrettes. And what came through was a hybrid plan that specified this sort of social space for events in the middle. This was a space that could support farmers markets, rain gardens, and a dog park as the main features of it. This is an early picture. Fortunately, these swamp white oaks are all still growing and now are about 6-inch diameter trees. Still doing fine. But this underlays a whole storage system. All of that checkered pavement is permeable. It flows overland in the direction of rain gardens. There are a collection that goes to subsurface detention that holds 70,000 gallons with the combined of the permeable pavement, the rain garden capacity, the subsurface about 200, a little short of 200,000 gallons, and well more than the 10-year storm, which is detained by this park. And then when we were doing this, we went to get a connection to the combined sewage system, and the sewer authority said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "We'd like it you would add something else." So there's a vault here that's a control vault that actually has a weir system and valve that can be controlled from the central sewage treatment plant. So they can watch it being filled to the top, and they can control when it discharges, when they have capacity in the treatment plant to take it. So it reduces on two levels. It does two things. The storage here reduces area flooding and dramatically reduces combined sewage overflow to the Hudson River, attributable to this area of Hoboken. So those two things. So these are some of the storage systems, which are these interlocking pipes under 3 or 4 areas of the park that go through, they all connect through to that control valve. And this is like really impossible to say, but I'll just say this is data. We get live data now. There's several years of operation. It's still working just fine. It's a completely a gravity system. A little storm is 100% detained by the system underneath. A very large storm over 18 hours, it's catching everything here. It's slowly discharging it. It rains again. And there is a period here where there's overflow and some backwater storage potential in the rain gardens as well. But that allows me to slowly discharge over time when there's treatment capacity in the sewage treatment plant. So everything that is underneath there in the bar represents volume of water that's not becoming CSO. And people used to ask in the design process, well, what's a rain garden and what's it going to look like? I said, it's going to look like a garden. It's going to look like a garden you put behind a fence, and it's going to look like plants. And it's still looking pretty much that good. This is like 2 years after construction. It's still looking quite good. They're doing a nice job with it. And that's some of the permeable pavement. There was custom signage where we worked with the Brooklyn firm to develop that. The rain garden behind. And it does have these amphitheater steps supporting the main thing. I think this may not need anything to say it. I studied with Paul Friedberg, who just died a few months ago. It's sort of a tribute to Paul. I think that I ended up doing a stepped amphitheater out of stone. And it's a center of community life. The Hoboken Parks does it. This is actually through their recreation department that they schedule these events. And there are probably 15 of these a year, in addition to the farmers markets that they run out of this place as well. And we are currently designing or constructing a second phase of this across the street, which is a much more active recreation park, because one thing at a time, and building up to a whole sort of system of neighborhood events. And the dog run. Now, am I a big dog run guy? No, I'm not really a big dog guy, I'll say that. But this dog run brings people out here from 6 in the morning to 10 o'clock at night, 12 months of the year. And it is sort of the eyes and ears of the place and makes it safe. And by providing this, it also allows the lawn to just be for children. And it's pretty well observed in this particular town. And that's my last slide. I don't know if I stayed within the 15 minutes, but I tried. And I do think New York City is now doing more parks like this. One of the things interesting, another project that we worked on with Matthijs, identifying areas of New York City that flood regularly, a cloudburst, rain event, kind of event, and starting to have discussions with DEP, and they're saying, maybe we do have to get into the business of actively pumping some of these areas. Maybe there are areas in New York City that will become a little bit more like New Orleans or Morgan City or stuff like this. That we, right now, there's not a city agency that does that. There are no actively mechanically drained low areas in New York City. That was an area in East Harlem we were working at, which if you went back to the streams, also used to be a marshland and a stream, where there are now 40,000 people living, or 30,000 people living. So,
and start with one or two, and then open it up to all of you. So this one is about site level solutions for Bushwick Inlet Park and the role of ecological design in resilience. And I think at this point, let's just I'll see who has, I'll ask a question and see who feels like answering it. I won't direct it at one of you in particular. So resilient parks go beyond green space. They function as flood absorbers and habitat corridors and urban heat mitigators. How can Bushwick Inlet Park serve as a model for multifunctional resilience, integrating stormwater management, sea level rise, ecological restoration, and public use? Obviously, you guys have all touched upon this, but maybe we can just revisit and kind of, if you can look at it through the lens of the Bushwick Inlet Park itself.
That's a lot to ask. I think these kinds of systems are complex, and they deserve thoughtful, knowledge-based, science-based responses. There are a lot of solutions out there in other places that you can look at. However, we know that every site is unique and needs to be looked at as its own special place. So I think it's hard to just give you a answer on that.
There's like, when you talk about resilience parks, there's sort of two ways in which you can understand what resilience is, right? You can sort of say, well, if the park is resilient, it can withstand, let's say, a changing climate or whatever sort of shocks and stresses it might have. But you can also say, well, you can think of the park as itself as an infrastructure for a sort of larger neighborhood, right? So in a way, the second park, the Hoboken Park that Steve showed, is like resilience infrastructure for an entire neighborhood. And I think on a number of levels, Bushwick Inlet can be resilience infrastructure for a larger area. But for instance, it can help clean some of the stormwater before it goes into the East River. It can help with heat mitigation. On the other hand, I also feel that given the historical place that this is, that you shouldn't start to think of it as an infrastructure that helps with flood protection or something like that, because historically this is a place that used to be wet, and I think acknowledging that wetness and learning to live with that wetness, so being sort of resilient to wetness because that's just part of it, I think is to me a more logical approach than starting to think of this as a piece of future flood protection like East River Park is becoming it. And so I feel that once you conceptualize this, you really want to think like, okay, what do I want the park to do for park in a way, and for people in the park, and for the ecosystems of the park, and what do you want it to do for a larger neighborhood? And those could help you figure out, I think, what a resilient park could mean in this particular case.
I'll be a little bit more specific, I think. As was pointed out by several remarks here, and no surprise to anybody, there is a sort of first threshold question about designing the future phases of Bushwick Inlet Park, which is how are you going to deal with the toxicity issues? And we were very lucky in the first phase here that our testing revealed only a few pockets of places, relatively small, that needed to be remediated or removed, and most of the rest could be capped without any risk to the public. So I think that not knowing what the results of those are or what the approach is, that's going to be one of the drivers about what you do here. I would hope that it's done in such a way that the second part of your assets here, which is the long shoreline and coastal area, that whatever is done relative to the program of remediation or containment of the toxicity as it's decided, also allows for a coastal zone that can be a living thing here in ecologically communicating with the East River of the water. I think that's really important here. And then the last thing, and I don't know what the conclusion is, but sort of echoing what Matthijs said, it's pretty easy outboard of Kent Avenue to say you're going to have a park that's not going to contribute any stormwater to the East River, that you can manage all your local stormwater in the park responsibly without connecting to the storms, without connecting with combined sewer. That's a pretty easy technical thing to do. The bigger question is, what role, if any, does the land assemblage of the park do relative to the resilience of the upland neighborhood? Whether it's something as extreme as the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project or other aspects, I don't even know what those considerations might be.
There is a lot of talk about the actual groundwater. The table has risen here, and in fact, there isn't really anywhere for water to go. There isn't a way for it to seep into the land anymore in many places in this area. And
I would also say relative to a pool of toxic material below, it's not necessarily a strategy you want to take here.
well, yes, and
Just to surcharge.
we've got the Newtown Creek on this side, and they're connected, and if you have a big storm event, and we don't know what's going to happen with the waters, those toxic waters, and what will rise out of the groundwater. It's a lot to think about.
It's not unknown, and it's very typical to have high groundwater in the floodplain, that the water is coming from the East River as well as from upland, and it's a porous system. So it's not unusual to have that situation. And there are many other examples of what the groundwater condition is like. You can look at Gowanus Canal and Newtown Creek and places in other parts of the country or parts of the world that have similar situations. It's not, you could predict pretty well what the groundwater contamination might be like.
One thing that's really always top of my mind is this idea of the original creek that empties out into the Bushwick Inlet, and that it actually is a connector to McCarran Park, and that just would make an extension of Bushwick Inlet Park, and we're always trying to expand Bushwick Inlet Park all over the place, but that would be something to consider when we talk about some of what you were talking about, Matthijs, or you, with the movement of sand and water, and living with that kind of mobility and I don't know, flexibility. I don't know what it.
That's a lovely idea, right? Because with that you could sort of increase the gradients between salt and fresh water in a really interesting way. So I think for the ability of ecosystems to develop here, it would be fantastic. And it's going to be really difficult because there's a lot of built stuff there, and the things in New York are really, really difficult. But I love it as a vision. I also feel that it sort of fits within a logic, right? Like Eric Sanderson, the ecologist, talks about blue zones, sort of places that were wet in the past, that are often wet now, but that definitely will be wet in the future, about 20% of the land surface of New York. And we need to appreciate that and learn how to work with those underlying natural systems that Marcha described in a phenomenal way, and try to respect them, and when possible, bring them back. Because the alternative is continuing to overbuild and put all this essentially fossil fuel or concrete infrastructure in place to sort of double down on something that is essentially a losing game.
It's been my observation that those kinds of connections, they make themselves. And in fact, if you go out when you have the next really big storm here and watch the water, I bet you'll see a connection between the Karen Park and this area. And often you can see the residue of it. Even if you weren't there when the puddles were actually forming, you can see go afterward and you see the trail. It's very, if you're looking for it, it's kind of evident that the water patterns are still there, even though they're not flowing like an open stream. You can still see, here's where all of the sinkholes are. They're kind of lining up. Or here's where the remains of the dust, which was carried, is in a streak. And you can kind of look for that and then see if it's, I bet you would notice a connection.
Will be influence from sea level rise, and there probably should be start to think about stormwater management strategies upland through McCarran Park, looking forward to the next 40 or 50 years. Whether perhaps that is an area where some sort of rain storage strategy, sort of like we're in the family of Hoboken. I'm not going to say it's exactly like, because every site is different, but it may be that there have to be a little bit more active watershed management upstream of Bushwick Inlet.
So, does anyone have a question? Would like to ask a question of our speakers, or I can keep asking questions.
Well, I'd like to say, I just think all of you guys for coming out. I mean, Catherine putting this together. This is an awesome program. That creek you're talking about from McCarran, I think it's a pedestrian passageway that's on the south side of the Automotive High School and the north side of the tennis courts. And there's, I think it's called Union Street Passageway or Bypass. But that is constantly wet, and it acts like it wants to move towards Berry Street and then down North 14th, right? And then North 14th basically spills right over here in Bushwick into the inlet itself. But I do have a question for the designers and the architects. When you design parks, like this Hoboken Park, for example, it appears as if there's a maintenance strategy that went hand in hand with the installation of the park itself. And if not a maintenance strategy was part of the initial project, did the maintenance of Hoboken develop out of the local organizations or nonprofit organizations or Hoboken Park department? Or who maintains that?
The horticultural management, the Hoboken Parks, that Hoboken Park right now is contracted out by their Parks Department. It's contracted out. It's a third party done through the Parks Department.
Yeah.
The friends, neighborhood groups, etc., participate in programming, but I would say it's pretty much done through the municipality. And it is in New York City. My firm and a lot of Laura's work as well, where we've been able to do horticulture that lasts, it is all been because there is somebody in place, some organization in place that's willing to take it on, whether that's the Battery Conservancy in Battery Park, which will be have a long association, or other places. And I probably shouldn't say this, it's one of the challenges of Bushwick Inlet Park, when I look at the horticulture here, is that basically, with the exception of some pockets down near the waterfront, where some of the herbaceous material has survived and been cordoned off in a way, I'm very grateful that the trees are doing well. Let me put it that way, in terms of what lasts and what survives. But any notion of a bioswale planting along the North 9th Street path, as long as law.
Right.
And it's very challenging.
Right.
Because it just doesn't, it's not in the standard protocols of our city park system.
Yeah. And do you think about that in the future when you design parks, like how you can integrate, because the survivability of the park is predicated on its future maintenance after you install it, right? After you walk away, you have a park that has potential for either being swallowed by Japanese knotweed or mugwort or Atlantis, and it's awesome for the first 2 or 3 years after installation, but then it's almost instrumental that you have some sort of mechanism to where there's community organizations tied in, and if they don't exist, they created almost from the whole endeavor of working along coast in England.
Well, part of that problem is the lack of funding for the Parks Department and gardeners. I mean, so we should all be supporting the 1% for parks in that matter, but yeah.
Even without that, there is something, and this is not unique to New York City parks, I don't want to make it sound like it is, but the very process of capital improvement in park systems and public works is usually a one and done operation. That you put out a project out to bid, it gets built by the contractor, it gets accepted by the city at final completion, and the contractor is off, and then basically it's handed to a maintenance entity. Let me just say with Bushwick Inlet Park how much I wish there could have, we were creating something that was never here before. We were making every kind of wild guess about how people would use it without any evidence. There was no empirical evidence to know how they would use it until they actually use it. And even if there had been $50,000 for like post-occupancy modifications within 3 years, it would have made a big difference for the subsequent 10 years. Just to be able to fix the things you didn't anticipate without just blaming, oh, you didn't, you know. There tends to be much more of a blame game going on than what do we need to do to fix it. I will say in Hoboken, there was something, there was a little lawn there. It sloped down to look nice and green around the surrounding neighborhood. And the children played on it, and one day a ball went out into Patterson Plank Road, and a councilman's daughter almost ran out to get it, and nobody was hurt, but let me just say that people were very agitated. What did they do? Yes, I got told, why didn't you think of this? I got all of that, but they said, what can you do to fix it? And an 18 or 20 inch high fence at the base of that lawn next to the sidewalk fixed it, and we went back and fixed it. It would be really helpful. I know now that if we're ever going to have any planting along that North 9th Street path going through the park, it has to have a low plant protection fence, or it'll never survive.
Right.
If we want that to happen, you know, I'm not going to say what has to happen. The ability to come back and incorporate lessons learned is really hard in the city capital process, and in any capital program process.
It is also one of the great impediments for the use of nature-based solutions or green infrastructure, right? Because it's less predictable, it requires less capital cost, but much more maintenance cost. You need to have this adaptive management that Steve is talking about, and all those things are not well organized within this process. More question?
Staying with this theme of how do we maintain the horticulture and get opportunities to go back and look at how we planned the development. Many decades ago, a bunch of us in the neighborhood were really against ever naming anything in a park for anybody because it's our parks, and I was very down with that. And then staying with this theme of how entrepreneurship and small business could play a role in nurturing the parks and giving back. we got smorgasbord, which to a certain degree is a nightmare. But the nightmare generates a lot of money. And it also is somewhat of an incubator for small businesses. It's like a job generator, it's a business generator. It is run completely separate from the state parks that lets them operate. So, the money is captured better now than it used to be, but how it's thought about as something positive for the community isn't very good. But it just seems to me that maybe we do need to build in, wherever it's possible, the capacity for the new parks, including Bushwick, to have the right to generate income, even if it's through events. Maybe events are better that are programmed and managed by a friends group, but to just have no entrepreneurship in a park where there is no maintenance budget. Now we're looking, I don't know if you all know this, we're looking at a business improvement district in the area that would try to divert some self-taxed money from all the property owners to do the horticulture. It might go through, it might not. It's a new thing. Who wants more taxes? I'm working on it for it. Ward is one of our leaders. But it's like what you just said is a fatal flaw of how the parks get put up in capitalist urban centers in America. And what do you think, in your experience, in the world or philosophically as environmental scientists and pro-parks people, is it terrible to look for a way to have some entrepreneurship that supports what needs to happen in a park? Thank you, please.
I'm a really big believer in planning together with local communities. That will make any plan just so much better because they will bring lived experience and knowledge into the planning process. But I think that what you say is equally important. You should not then only plan for what the park should look like. You should plan with the community members for stewardship. You need to start thinking about a park not as a capital project, but as a living organism of which the community is a part. And with that, things like how do we maintain it, where can resources come from, etc., can be taken into account in what I then hope is a sensitive, sensible, and equitable way.
I think you're bringing up a really good point. Thank you for acknowledging that there's something wrong with the way we do construct parks without having an automatic, well-oiled machine to maintain them. I think it's a very important thing. In some places, there has been this idea of a public-private partnership where the park generates its money, and that goes to help with the construction and the both construction and maintenance. In my observation, the public-private partnership is an unequal one, that the public is often shortchanged. That you get the private part of it, but the public benefits are compromised. I don't have any real easy solution for this, but I've looked at a variety of different kinds of ways to try to do this, and it seems to me the most logical is to change the way city government funds parks. And in some cases we have huge money generators. Yankee Stadium, the USTA in Flushing Meadows Park, huge generators. And none of that money goes directly to the Parks Department. I think that's just that's a legal thing that could be switched with a couple of bills.
I think, as a matter of fact, that is a big consideration right now. Putting kind of a ticket, it's almost like a ticket tax to the people who go to the open tennis open or games, that you just add $1, or maybe it doesn't even have to be $1 to each ticket, and all of that would go to funding parks. I heard about that idea in the
Well, it's interesting puzzle. Let me just say, the trouble with saying you're going to have a dedicated source of income from events in New York City parks is that it's all fungible in the city budget process. And let's say, oh, we're generating $100 million here from our events, that's $100 million we don't have to put in from tax levy. And it doesn't automatically result in greater funding just because you're taking money. The money that's generated in Yankee Stadium and USTA goes into the city's general fund where it's distributed through our budget process. The saddest group I ever met with when I was at the Parks Department was a delegation in the 1990s from Bridgeport, which had a self-funded system. And they were down to 18 people running the entire, which was mainly from a parking lot at a beach, and 18 people, of whom 14 were required to work at the zoo, which was under consent decrees for animal cruelty, and they had 4 people running the entire park system because they were self-funded. So it comes down to a general challenge. Unfortunately, or historically, the United States has tended to view parks and libraries, and I've probably come up with a couple categories, as charitable endeavors and not as essential services. And they are often poor sisters at the budget process. Now, I say this as someone, I worked for parks for 13 years. I love parks. I love the New York City park system and admire the people who try to make that system work as best they can every day. And I really, I honor them. They are facing some tough things. I don't quite share Marcha's feelings about public-private partnerships. I don't think we've sold out Central Park. I think tens of millions of people enjoy it every day, and it looks beautiful because they have managed to find a way to get people to give money to it. My partner Laura Starr was chief of design there, and though it seems really silly, they spent an awful lot of time, design effort, trying to figure out how to design donor plaques. And the effort was to try to find a way to design donor plaques so it looked like it was part of the landscape and wasn't simply satisfying the vanity of the donor, in terms of trying to keep it under scale. And so it was always a battle. We have worked with the Battery Conservancy for many years, which maintains 6 acres of the most beautiful perennial gardens in New York City, with private donations, with no fence, with no admission, and people enjoy it every day. There are ways I think this can be managed. I'm going to say this at risk of being unpopular. I'm kind of shocked, having been involved in getting in this building, that the revenue potentials of this building have never been explored, that they have never been found a way, I have an office in Hudson, New York, a few people who live up there and work there. You can't rent a barn for a wedding in Hudson, New York for under $15,000 to $25,000 for one event. And I don't think you need to turn this into Tavern on the Green in order to have a modest revenue stream that can be generated from this building and coexist with all the community events that you still want to have happen here. I will freely admit there are a million ways that relationship could go wrong too. But I think there are ways to get resources into the North Brooklyn parks with diligence and sensitivity, and yes, with an eye towards maintaining a public perspective in how you do it.
Thank you. Steve?
Yeah, in regard, one of the issues that I noticed in our local parks is due with erosion, which Marcha talked about, both by the waterfront where there's soft edges. It seems like riprap is kind of the go-to design. We're often on the shorelines on top of fabric. You find that it just starts slipping into the water, there's exposed fabric and soil erosion. And then upland, notice that, especially like parks like Transmitter Park, the soil erosion is just incredible. Just that the park is, I guess, about 12 years old, but it's eroded almost down to the original grade of the land, and the wind impact there is really severe. So I'm just wondering if there, practices have evolved in terms of having that soft shoreline experience, on the waterfront, that sustainable in the long term, and then also the upland connected areas in terms of both dealing with wind, the onslaught of severe wind, and wave action.
Well, I think what you're describing is nature trying to reestablish what the system would bear. Probably, and I'm just guessing at this point because I don't know the specifics of it, I'm guessing that the riprap was steeper than the natural shore. And so what the system might have been trying to do is level off some of that steepness so that it was more, it was a gentler grade that would be able to stay there longer. As far as the, kind of observing that it looks like the original natural grade of the land is reappearing is not really that surprising. The wind, the action of the water, the storms and all of that build shores. That's how shorelines are constructed in nature. They move around, but they are acted upon by these powerful forces. And when we artificially make a berm or a dune, a so-called dune, where we think that would look nice, and the natural systems disagree, they will move it around until it's something more like what it was originally. I think there's just a tendency. It's the same with this pattern of water connecting where the old stream was. Given enough time, those footprints of the original natural system make themselves more and more evident. We can fight it. You can continue to rebuild a place like that, but I think when you're talking about the riprap slumping and revealing the filter fabric behind it, it sounds to me like it's too steep for the system to bear.
So is the solution to build less steep?
So every
every
site's going to be different, and if you need to have it steep because you're protecting something that you have to have it there, then you build it, you keep rebuilding it. Most of the infrastructure is designed for a 50-year lifespan. Just saying. So, it's going to be rebuilt at some point, probably.
I would say there's one other factor that affects New York City parks more than any other place I've ever been, is that I can't think of any place where the parks get more use from more people and their dogs than New York City parks. I grew up in the suburbs of Cleveland, and I played on perfectly nice grass athletic fields that got no more maintenance than the maintenance in New York City. They just got 5% the amount of use. And that is kind of huge. So there's a larger question, I think, too, in addition to dealing with natural forces. How can you design things that make the natural plant cover, whether it's turf or other things, more likely to establish and hold without getting torn up? And what kind of maintenance you have to do. I managed to go to Paris this year. That's not a brag, but their parks, nobody walks on the grass in the winter. They have these beautiful chairs in the Luxembourg Gardens and nice green grass, and every chair is on the wide path, so there's not a single person on the grass. I'm not saying that's how Americans live or treat their parks, but there is a direct correlation. My favorite last story, because it's local, is that I showed that little model of the shoreline, and there was a little shelf that we designed in the riprap there was above the high tide line so that you could be able to get down right near the water at high tide. And we got these beautiful, specified these river cobbles there. And the erosive effect of people between the age of 8 and 18 cannot be underestimated because within 6 months, 4 tons of rocks were thrown into the East River and they were all gone.
And the rocks, the people who stack the rocks,
We have we need to wrap up. We have one more question here, and then Steve, I'm going to make one more thing to show you, and then you can go, and thank you for your time, but Trina.
My question, you've all talked about the importance of a natural shoreline, especially along the East River. What we have in the Bayside parcel is deep, deep toxicity that even when you remediate it, is there a way to create a natural shoreline given the contamination in the soil of the Bayside parcel?
I don't know the conditions and where the plume of contamination is. And so I'd be speaking, and whether there's, well, it would all be supposition that would be the same thing.
If you just let it go wild, it will become green, and there will be organisms that are tolerant of it. That's probably not what this community is going to end up with. You're probably going to get it remediated in the standard way, which is dredge it, put it on trucks, and ship it to some other place. So there are some things that, without being prescriptive, there are some things that a community group like this could ask for. You could explore the idea that you want to end up with a shoreline that is not vertical, but is stepped, terraced, sloped, or some other way shaped, but not a vertical bulkhead. The cheapest, although it's not cheap, but the cheapest solution on shorelines is the steel sheeting. All of construction engineers and marine engineers know exactly how to do this. It's a 19th century technology, hasn't really changed since then. We're in a 21st century climate and ocean condition and cultural condition. It's my opinion that the steel sheeting is an archaic technology that we should stop doing. There are other solutions. Whether that is a natural shore, I think probably what's going to happen here is some kind of hybrid. To let it go just completely, find its own elevation, find its own water system is probably not what will happen on an urbanized part of New York City. But if you did just leave it alone, as it has been kind of, and this is what I sort of studied for my PhD, looking at post-industrial waterfronts that were just left abandoned. They become very interesting ecologically with having a lot of different kinds of organisms. They are polluted, absolutely. And some of those organisms are probably suffering from liver cancers and stuff. But you can have a lot of regeneration of natural conditions by just leaving it alone. In this location, there's a big demand for more recreational use of it.
I might say too, without knowing the limits of the plume, if the engineers say we have to put in some sort of sheeting or barrier to contain this within an area, contain this volume within an area, if there's any way that sheeting can be inland from the shore, reserving a zone of 40 to 70 feet between the sheeting and the shoreline, you then have the room to create any number of different more natural gradients to the shoreline and a more biologically active edge, as opposed to having the sheeting right at the interface with the water.
And I think that's been done in a few other places. So, let's visualize that.
Matthijs, do you have anything to add? Okay. Well, I think we're going to wrap up. A round of applause for section of, the Motiva section where the inlet is the northernmost part of the park, and next to it, Steve, are the slides there? There is a proposal to develop high-rise towers right on the edge of the park, really only 50 feet from the water's edge. And this is property that's owned by the MTA, and that low-slung brick building is the site that we're talking about. It's almost 2 acres, a little less than 2 acres, and you can see that it's very close to the edge. The MTA in 2019 wanted to access their resources to help them bail themselves out, so they put a RFP for development. And right now what's on the table are 2 mega high-rises, the highest on the waterfront, 600 feet and 450 feet, and this would be a third taller than the high-rises you see today. They're offering 1,200 housing units. This is from their deck, sort of illustrating what would come. Anyways, we feel like there are a lot of alternatives for this publicly owned space. We were not asked by the MTA how we wanted to use it. There's never been any community scoping for it. And so anyways, we invite you to go to our website, Save the Inlet, and learn more about the issues surrounding this. There's going to be a presentation of their project on April 1st and to the community board. And it's going to be at the Polish Slavic Center. And we invite you all to come and learn more about this.
I think it's on the next slide.
And,
Here.
oh, sorry, yeah, this is it. And so I know you all want to get home, but thank you for listening, and hopefully we'll get involved.